This is Maiku, and you are listening to the Narrow Path in the Floating Mountains podcast. This is a podcast that is dedicated to stories and tellings of my spiritual experiences and its relationship with mental health. Some of the stories I will be sharing will cover many topics such as the parallels in spirituality and mental health, ghost stories, dreams, tarot reading, mediumship, and more. I do want to provide a disclaimer that I do not have any certification in spiritual healing, mental health therapy, nor do I have an altar to practice Hmong shamanistic healing or rituals. Many of the stories I will be sharing are based purely on my personal experiences and how I have made sense of them throughout the years. So to those who are listening to this podcast, I hope that you will enjoy my stories and join me on the narrow path in the floating mountains. I am back with another episode. For this episode, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about spiritual spaces and communities. I think oftentimes when people are beginning their journey, it's a little bit intimidating to figure out what spaces are safe for them. And when I mean safety, it's like, what spaces can I allow myself to be full-on vulnerable? Or do I know enough? Am I spiritual enough to be in these spaces? So I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. And when I talk about spiritual spaces, it could be anything from virtual spaces to in-person spaces like healing center, places where you do meditation circles, even yoga, or even spiritual fairs where it's a space that people can congregate to network or just learn a little bit more about the community. So just my experiences, what I've experienced in these spaces and how I navigate them. I'm trying to be less structured with my podcasts because when I do that, I feel like there's an obligation to be knowledgeable about these things, and so I try to do my research. Part of it is research, part of it is, again, wanting to stick to sharing my experiences, but think about these episodes or this podcast as think pieces, or again, just remembering that this comes from my perspective, and hopefully it resonates with others, because I think it is important to hear different perspectives, different ways that people have navigated their healing journey, their mental health journey, or again, what the focus of this episode is, spiritual spaces. For me personally, what I look for in spiritual or healing spaces is that my thoughts and ideologies on spirituality or healing are embraced, and that there's no judgment, that it's really, the engagements are really from a place of unconditional love, and that I'm supported, that on the one hand, I'm still a human being navigating these spaces, and so respect for one another's opinions, views, also boundaries for me is a huge thing. I don't want my boundaries to be crossed, and I also want to be respected for that, right? Respected for our boundaries, because even though with spiritual healing and energy healing, you are gauging and feeling the energies of others, that there is still a boundary that needs to be had, right? An example of boundaries being crossed in spiritual spaces is, I'm trying to think of an example. Say you're at a spiritual fair, and then you're walking by this table, right? Even though it's a spiritual fair, everyone's kind of there to have a spiritual experience, learn more about other offerings in the community, and that everyone there has some connection to their intuitive, psychic, or medium gifts that even though it's a place for that there should still be boundaries. There should still be boundaries where a person who can do readings or can access that information doesn't go up to you and tell you like, hey, you have a message. So to be more specific, say you're walking past a vendor and this vendor offers tarot reading or mediumship. You walk past this vendor and this vendor just comes up to you and tells you like, hey, you think you have something, there is an important message for you, and I want you to, well, they don't necessarily say I want you to, because they want you to be curious enough to engage in a reading with them, right? So they will say things along the lines of there's an important message from you, from the ancestors, or there's something that needs to be cleared, or someone is thinking of you. Would you be open to having a reading? And even though they're asking you for this, like, you can object to it. But if they're pushy with it, then that means like your boundaries, they're not honoring your boundaries, your spiritual and energetic boundaries, right? Like, it's important to have those, because in the same way that you can receive negative energy from people, or attachments can latch onto you, the same thing can be said about someone going into your spiritual or energetic space to invade it, right? To open up or to search within your records or within your aura to access, basically like exploit that. So in a way, it's very exploitative. So for me, having a spiritual space or a healing space or a community that honors that and understands that, like the people moving within that, like you're not forced to say like engage in a reading with someone else, or someone isn't trying to solicit that in you. It's very invasive. Sometimes at spirit fairs, it's hard, like you do feel the energies of others, but it still has to come there still has to be like consent that comes in with it, right? For example, even though you're at a beach and everyone's wearing their swimsuit, you're not going to go up to a person and start engaging in a conversation about their body parts, right? Like, how rude would that be? I know that's like very generalized, but it's like that. So spiritual spaces, that's kind of how I navigate them. If that's how I know like I'm comfortable, right? I'm comfortable. I used to, the first time I started navigating these spaces, it was definitely like intimidating. It was definitely intimidating because I'm like, I don't want anyone to read me. On top of that, I just want to be normal in this place, right? Because everyone else is like you in this space. I don't want myself to like stick out anymore. It's interesting too, and this is just kind of like a tangent that I'm going on, when I have people who are like, I tell them about how I don't tell, even if I'm getting things, I'm channeling, or downloading information, or just by sheer like getting a message from someone, that I don't go and tell the person. I don't tell them that something's going on, right? Or that a message is coming through for them. I kind of just like leave it where it is, because the person who that message is intended for, it's not, if they're not actively seeking it, I'm not gonna engage in it. So I say that because I do have I've met quite a few people who utilize readings. Not specifically with me, but had also heard in conversations where people who engage in getting services done by other people, that they welcome when people get messages, and even though they didn't ask for it, that they welcome them. And that's one way of thinking about it. I think for me, I still wouldn't even if they're like, yeah, tell me everything, like I want to know everything. I don't, because that's a lot. That's like a tall order. That's a tall order to fulfill. And not only that, I don't want to be working on my day off, if that makes sense. And so, in some spiritual spaces, some people, they like that. Some people, whether they are aware of how to access those gifts or not, they welcome it. And I don't know, it's like really, really weird for me. I never try to solicit or exploit anyone's healing or anyone's ancestors, because it is also very overwhelming. It can most definitely be overwhelming. There are some healers out there who are really invasive. The feelings that I get from it, and I've had this in spiritual, like at spiritual fairs too, even though it's like a whole ass fair where people are utilizing their gifts or their skills, that I have felt that by readers. There's been quite a handful of times too where I've gone into a space just to go buy crystals, and the person ringing me up just is kind of like sending their energetic tentacles to like read, like, oh, what am I, like, what is it that I need healing for? And that's it. It's really weird. It's really weird, but I kind of just like, I don't invite it, but I don't engage in it, because a part of me is like, you know what? I'm still human, and I don't have to engage with it. I don't have to open myself up to it. Like, I don't want to know what this person is trying to figure out about me. Not because I have secrets, it's just boundaries. I'm like, and this is not the place and time to do it. Like, if I need your help, I'll ask for your help. And not only that, it's like, I know how to access this. Like, I'm not completely unaware of it. And it's kind of interesting, though. It's kind of interesting when I do that, because then I will know, but I don't know if they know that I know. And in a way, it kind of gives, I kind of feel like Clark Kent sometimes in that way, because I feel like I'm a type of person where I'm very unassuming, and kind of like, I don't really put myself out there as like a very eccentric or charismatic person. A lot of people tell me I'm very laid back, and so when I access these like spiritual spaces, I'm very unassuming. And so the thing with this, so it was like a crystal store. It was a crystal store, and I was there, and the person ringing me up, and for that day when I went into the store, it was actually my second time going to the store. I had like this banging headache, and the store also sells herbal teas, herbal teas and herbal ingredients. And so I went in for something, and as I'm ringing this up and I'm like buying these things, I can feel the tentacles of the cashier just kind of like trying to read me. And I kind of knew, it was pretty obvious, because she was kind of like, she had this gaze where she was trying to figure out like what I was dealing with. And I think it was because she just started and she was like trying things out. And so I just kind of was like, in my head, I was like, I don't think she wants this headache. And so for me, I was thinking, I'm like, I don't care. I'm not going to give you anything, but I have this headache. And if you are trying to send out your tentacles, your feelers, you're going to catch this. And so oftentimes when that happens, I'm just kind of like, you know what? Like, do what you will. I got nothing. But if you want to take this headache, go ahead and take this headache. But anyways, I didn't know what happened afterwards. I just kind of paid for my stuff and then I left. But that's probably a time where I've gone into a spiritual space and boundaries are being crossed. I've had other situations where I've done classes or I've been in healing circles where people try to are just kind of like, so the class I'm talking about, we're just trying out how to figure out how to be in tune with our psychic gifts, right? The feeling, the emotions, the just trying to access this person's like aura to download a message for them, right? And we do this by just literally sitting in front of each other and we're just kind of saying what is being intuitively fed to us. And it could be things from like, okay, random images that are coming up that are not part of that train of thought, words, people, just a multitude of things. And the person sitting in front of me was kind of just I don't think she meant any harm by it. I think she was just really trying to be in touch with or trying to do her best at the exercise. And the things that she was saying was that, you know, I partied or I was a nurse and I was very social, which is a complete opposite of who I am. I'm not social. I'm not a nurse. And I don't party. I'm like I think I've been done with that since I had my son or even prior to that. But anyways, I was also the youngest in the group, so I can guess why. But it was really interesting. I didn't feel like there was any harm to it, but it was a very interesting thing. I didn't feel offended by it either because, again, I knew like she was trying her best. And sometimes being connected to these skills, takes a bit to exercise them or just refine them. And even myself, I've downloaded or I've connected with information that's not accurate, like small details or even messages. And oftentimes I'll tell people, like, take it with a grain of salt if it doesn't resonate, because we are all beings that can feel each other, or we just, use our own critical thinking or our own way of making sense of things based on our experiences to hone or channel in that information. And so I never try to make anyone feel bad about getting something wrong, because we're all still learning. I'm still learning. I think going back to spiritual spaces and communities that I feel, the types of characteristics that I look for in these spaces where I know I can feel safe in, is that within these spaces there's a level of understanding about vulnerability. That everyone there is vulnerable, like we're opening ourselves up emotionally, intuitively, metaphysically, and spiritually. And so with that vulnerability and understanding of like how to navigate one another. Obviously, we are all still human, so we still have human emotions, right? We still are able to feel a multitude of emotions and energies. And so things are bound to happen in these spaces, but as long as there is a level of understanding about vulnerability and offering options to express your vulnerability, but that we can all nurture each other's vulnerability without, again, crossing boundaries. I think that's, for me, like, it's very, when I enter these spaces, I try to navigate it in a way where it's like, okay, how do I know I can trust these individuals in this space? How do I know I can trust them with my vulnerability? And it just really comes down to the same things that you would do with like networking at a party or getting to know people at a party. If the way that you're communicating is in sync and you just feel really good, a really good connection from it, or even the level of vulnerability that you share with one another, and that person is able to nurture that in the best way that they can. Not that everyone should overcompensate, right? But I think when someone shows how they can handle me being vulnerable, my vulnerability. I'm trying to figure out how to say it. So if my vulnerability was like an egg and I give it to someone and I see how they handle that egg, if it is taken care of where it's not going to drop or it's not going to crack, then I am able to trust that. And so I'm never one to keep testing the waters, but I utilize the space that I'm in to draw in conversations, just kind of like get to know people, also get to learn about people and their spiritual journeys. And once I'm able to gauge that, then I know like, okay, this is someone who I can trust, right? To the extent it does sound like there's a lot of judgment, right? Because I talked before about how spaces that can leave behind judgment or aren't judgmental, that's a space that I can feel myself feeling safe in. That when I talk about vulnerability in the example I just gave, I feel that it is a gray area with like judgment, but I think I've gotten to a point where it's like, okay, I can understand where they're coming from, but it's not like vibing with me right now. And I totally get where they're coming from. I totally get where it needs to be healed, and this is where I need to be healed, but it's okay to agree to disagree type of situation. And so another situation where I've kind of had the ick where I have this person is a service provider that when I was in the session, after the session, there was a conversation about how the healing could have been done better. Like it would have been more effective if I wasn't clothed. And not only that, the person was a male figure. And just the setting in itself, I was just kind of like, this is kind of intense. This is kind of crazy. I'm like having triggers right now. I think when he had said that, I was just like, nope, I'm not coming back. It worked, but I was like, I kind of have a feeling that I might be pushed to do something that I'm not comfortable doing, and this is skirting around that. This person actually goes to fairs to do services, and And it's pretty effective. Like, it is pretty effective, but you know, you could still be really good at what you do, but still be, even if you are a healer or the intention is to like heal people or help people get better, that there can still be some harm that can be done, right? Like, we've seen a bunch of that happen even in the medical field, where these doctors are now being found to be abusers, right? Perpetrators or predators. And so the same thing can be said about spiritual spaces and practitioners too. So I don't want to jump too much into that because it might derail, but that's an example of like, okay, I think I need to walk away because this guy's telling me that it would work better if I had all my clothes off, and that's pretty freaking scary for me. That's a red flag for me. Like, I'm spiritual, but that's just not for me. Some people might be and they're comfortable with that, but not me, because of my complex trauma and my past. So, you know, like, spiritual spaces, I think I'm sharing this because spiritual spaces are still physical, real spaces. And the way that you navigate them, the people in them are still real people. There's still a very people-y aspect of it, even though the things that are going on within these spaces are very much about the metaphysical, energy, ethereal, spiritual, like things that are not tangible, that there can still be harm, right? Again, like the mental health spaces, I go back to just thinking about what I need for myself at the moment. And whenever I access these spaces, it's like, if I'm not ready to heal it and this session isn't working for me because a lot of what this provider is saying is triggering me, then I think it's okay to have a second opinion too, right? Or to just step away from it. I speak from the perspective of actually going to a therapy session, and I think it was like my third session with this therapist, and she had made a comment that was like very judgmental, or she had made a comment where all of a sudden my story was no longer being it was no longer from the perspective of like, look at how complicated the situation is. I think like compassion, really. Like, she was no longer hearing me talk about my story from a place of compassion. She was hearing it from the place of like, the things that is happening and you having a connection with this situation is going to be harmful, and you need to reevaluate what it's going to be. It's kind of hard for me to explain because it's still kind of like everything connected to this therapy session is very much rooted in my survivorship, and so, or my healing journey, and so I don't want to share that. But I had the session with a therapist, and then I think the fourth time I was coming back around, she ended up rescheduling, or she ended up discontinuing my sessions with her. And then I kind of got the hint too, because I was also thinking like, hey, I didn't really like how she was communicating, so I'm going to go somewhere else. And I did explain that to her, because I think we were communicating via email too. And she had mentioned that, I had written an email to her saying that I wasn't comfortable with her comment, and I felt like it was coming from a place of judgment, and that I no longer felt comfortable going to her. And she was completely fine with it, because I think she already had her own judgments about what I was going to her for. So I think there's a lot of layers to it. I think there's points of places in my experience with that had to do with the stigmatizing mental health. And I want to also talk a little bit about the stigmas in mental health, but also spirituality in another episode. But there is some aspect to that to the therapy session that I was having. And so like I obviously discontinued that and never went back to do clinical therapy just because it was such a scary experience for me. It was that I never truly feel like I could trust a therapist with the full extent of my story. And because of that, I just truly, honestly feel like clinical therapy is just not for me. And that could be a reason why not a lot of people go to clinical therapy, because their issues are so complex that there's a fear that the therapist can turn on them. Say if it is a situation where it's a lot more complicated than it seems, right? So I eventually like stepped away from clinical therapy spaces, but also support groups. I think on that note too, I also want to talk a little bit about support groups, because they do function as healing spaces, right? Healing through community and shared stories. I think my experiences with support groups, it's always been positive. It's always been positive, but there's also this fear of like, what if somebody also attends these support groups, because essentially they're supposed to be somewhat anonymous, or your identities are protected, or things that you talk about stays within the groups. They never go outside. And so I think for me, my experience was that I was going to support groups and they were helping, but I think at that time too, I just really didn't know who to trust. And I was still kind of like testing the waters with who do I trust my story to, or who can I confide in, like who's going to support me. Because everything had been pulled from underneath me. Like I had no substantial like support system with family members and even friends, because I was being seen as like, or I didn't share it with them, but I always felt ashamed when I did disclose something to friends. And so support groups was like a way for me to have that sort of system. But then I started feeling like the ceiling was coming in on me, where I started seeing familiar faces that I had never seen before, or I had never seen in the groups, but I saw outside of the groups. And because of that familiarity, I began to get paranoid. I began to feel like I couldn't trust it. I think mostly because I was being fed like misinformation about being in these groups, and I wish I would have trusted my gut. I really did, because I feel like the support group was really working for me. But I know that in healing, there's a lot of trying to reestablish trust, and I think I didn't have, and it's not I think, like I know I didn't have enough support or enough confidence to trust in that the support groups were truly is truly where I could hold my it could be confidential. And so at that time too, I actually left support groups too, because then I started seeing people who were distant relatives also attend, and I left. And it was just a really weird time. I think, honestly, as someone who has been through that process of clinical community support, but also like spiritual spaces and support, I can honestly say, like, as someone who's navigated those spaces, like, there's a lot of back and forth. Or even if you are a healer who is providing services to someone who has complex trauma, right? There's a lot of back and forth with the people who navigate these spaces, because you have to remember that a lot of their healing is founded on some level of trauma that has disrupted that trust with their vulnerability with new groups of people, or even people who are close to them, right? That has been so destroyed that it's not consistent, right? So people who you're providing services to, it's not going to be consistent. And I found that even with my own personal journey and with my own clients, that it is very much a back and forth thing. But also having boundaries to as a provider, to not to have a healthy boundary, basically, is what I'm saying too. So in these spiritual spaces, these healing spaces or community spaces, that there's a healthy level of boundaries, but also being tender with the vulnerability egg that I was talking about. I think overall, the most important thing for me when accessing spiritual spaces or healing spaces, no matter if it's like spiritual or mental health, right, that consent and boundaries is a huge thing. We think about consent and boundaries as it relates to like our bodies, but it can also be something that can be applied to, again, the intangible things, right? You don't want someone, if you're not open to someone tapping into your Akashic records, they shouldn't. And the same thing can be said about someone who's like not ready to receive Reiki too. Like, you can't force Reiki onto someone if they're not ready for it. And it's not that they're not vibrating high enough to obtain Reiki. It's just that right now, at that moment in their timeline, that Reiki is just not what they need, right? They probably need something else. And so thinking about it that way too, like, when we're talking about like mental health, right? Somebody who's obviously upset, they're not going to want, and they're still processing things on their own. They're not going to want someone to come in and tell them like, hey, you need therapy, I can help you. Like, I think you're dealing with abandonment because your mom and dad left you, or something like that, right? Like, who wants to be told that if they're not ready to be confronted with that, or they haven't yet come to terms with embracing that, right? It's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot for the person. And so in that context, consent and boundaries is still needed, even though someone is like visibly upset because someone like left them out of an event, and they're obviously having very visceral reactions to being left out, that someone who sees it comes along and says like, well, you're obviously upset, I think you're dealing with abandonment issues, like, I can help you. And the person who's like probably dealing with abandonment issues is like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, no, I don't. They're they're just not going to be ready to deal with that aspect of their healing journey. And I've learned that a lot with my partner, with my husband. You can't, even with your partners, you can't push your partners to heal, even though you're seeing it, that if they're not ready, you can't push them. That goes with like family members or siblings. Like you can see like the family trauma or the ancestral trauma or the generational trauma that is taking place and unfolding in front of you, and you're like, oh my gosh, like this is like a hot mess. This is such a hot mess that you can't just go in and be like, everyone needs to heal because y'all got some ancestral trauma that y'all need to heal from. And once you get it healed, then you guys will be at harmony and peace. How arrogant that would sound, right? How arrogant it would sound if like you step into that family dynamic trying to tell the family to heal. Like, I promise you, there would be a reverse reaction. So in that scenario too, like consent and boundaries are still applicable to family members too, family members and partners. But speaking of like spiritual spaces and communities, this is what I look for. It's consent and boundaries. And I feel like this whole episode could have been dedicated to consent and boundaries, but I want it to be applicable in different contexts too, and provide my experience as case studies for you guys. I know I didn't really go and elaborate into it, but that's the intuitive like tool that I use to navigate spaces. And I think it could be said like to use that for yourself too as you navigate spaces, right? Like when I was talking about the person who just goes into the family to be like, y'all need to heal, like that's crossing their boundaries. They're like, well, who are you to tell us like what we need to heal? Like, you don't even know us. Like, you weren't even there when all of this crazy shit was happening in our family, right? Like, yeah. So anyways, I think for me, those two are the main things that I think at the very top of my list of like, okay, when is this, like, is this space okay for me to be vulnerable or not? And it's consent and boundaries. Another example I want to provide is accessing spiritual healing spaces is that if someone or a facilitator or a moderator is calling for you to channel in energy that you do not want to channel or tune into, or you do not feel comfortable connecting with, and you're still being told to do it, like you honestly don't have to. You honestly don't have to, because I think for me, that's happened. That's happened for me. Like I was asked to call in a certain energy. I like verbalized like I don't want to bring in this energy, but then I was still forced to, and it was kind of like, well, now you're the sacrificial lamb. And you're the sacrificial lamb, and this is an example of what I'm still processing it. To be honest, I am still processing it, but I feel like as a healer too, being mindful of how you handle your client's vulnerability ache, and then vice versa, right? Like, you don't have to do whatever it is you're not comfortable doing. It's just like going on a camping trip and or a wellness retreat, and the activity calls for you to walk over a thing of like coals, right? Like hot coals. And you're like, I'm actually not comfortable doing this. Like, do I have to do it? And you're still being forced to, right? But in your body, you might even have like a triggering reaction to stepping on coals, and you're still being required to do it. That what that can make you feel. I think there is a fine line between going outside your comfort zone, but also being forced to do something. And how I gauge that, right? When is it going outside my comfort zone, and when is it being forced to do something? I gauge it based on how that person is facilitating that activity. If there's room for me to explore my options, then I'm like, okay, I will feel more comfortable doing it. It can give me the option to do it now or later or whenever I want to. If it's like on the spot, right then and there, step on the coals, or else you're going to fail, or else you're not going to be spiritual enough, then something's not right. Because for me, again, my spiritual healing is very closely tied to my mental health healing journey. And a lot of it does have to do with like consent and boundaries. And so for me, if my physical body is being forced to do something I'm not comfortable with, then the same is going to go with my spirit. My spirit is going to be telling me like, okay, this is not okay because your body is being forced to do something that they're not comfortable with. That I'm going to know. Because I mean, for me, this disconnection from spirit and body was what was making me, was why I needed healing journey anyways. And I try to be mindful of that with my clients too. I don't know what my clients have gone through. I don't force them to tell me. It's just an automatic, like, you don't have to open up to me. I won't pry whatever it is that we're unpacking today. I won't pry. I won't push you to reveal or unpack whatever you're not ready to unpack. But if you are, you don't even have to verbalize it to me. That's usually how I frame it. I think too, like, my experiences has led me to be more conscious about how to hold space for others, right? Again, for me, it's consent and boundaries. And from that, the guidelines that I present, even though they are slow and steady, even though some people are wanting to react to the visceral parts of it, I'm still giving them options to be like, hey, you can, but you don't have to. Like, I never want to push someone to confront the emotions that they're not ready to. Because no matter what, you're going to be doing that outside of healing, right? You're already doing so much work confronting these things every day. Why does this healing process have to resort to that, right? So that's how I think. I'm like, for people who are wanting to do healing or pursuing healing services to unpack, what I would say is that well, not just services, but I think I'm speaking of it in a way of like the service provider, right? So for the service provider, if you think about it, the people who are coming to you, they're already dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis, right? And so them coming to you for these healing services is a refuge from that. It's a refuge from doing it on their own. And confronting these dense emotions or these dense pieces of trauma, that they come to these healing sessions as a point of refuge from doing it alone. And they just want someone to hold their hand through the process. They want someone to coach them through it. They want someone to teach them what's another way to do this, right? So a lot for me is teaching them how to do it, navigating them through it, and then exploring that and being available in the case that they have questions or they need resources. And so for me, a lot of my own personal experiences has informed how I hold space for people. And one thing for me is I never want to push or pry the traumas that people are unpacking. And even if they're bringing that to the front in this session and they're thinking about it, that it can still be kept safe within their own way of processing it, that their conscious self, their emotional self, spirit, whatever it is that holds it together, that they can still feel safe within that, right? They can still feel safe within that to process it on their own. And for me, I help them to navigate it that way so that it becomes more empowering. It becomes more empowering for them to confront these things in a little easier way. Also, like, just snapping themselves out of the usual ways that they've processed these emotions. I'm saying emotions a lot because for the majority of my healing sessions, we do emotional unpacking and emotions as energy. And so I navigated that way. Help them to. Also because emotions are a little bit more recognizable. So I think, again, I'm going off on a tangent, but this is how, like, I navigate them. The types of characteristics of spiritual spaces, fairs, communities, healing spaces. These are what I look for when navigating them. It doesn't mean that they're bad. I think it's just not for me. Some people can do well in those spaces, and some people can't. Like, for me, I can't. I can't if my boundaries are crossed or my consent has been denied, or not my consent has been denied, but my consent has been taken away. And so that goes for, I think I talk about this because it helps me to reflect on the types of spaces that I want to create. And they're always at the forefront for me, is because it's been such an issue for me in my healing journey that I never want to create a space where it continues to contribute to this layer of trauma or layer of healing that people need to do. So I try my best to alleviate it, and I think a lot of it is, again, informed by just my personal experiences. But I think this is it. I feel like this could have been a 2-part episode of just talking about spiritual spaces, but also consent and boundaries. But maybe I'll still be able to do an episode on consent and boundaries. But I hope that you all enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you can tune in to the next one. And that concludes this episode of The Narrow Path and the Floating Mountains. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you can tune in for the next one.
She calls me day and night. I'm sorry.